Venice, 1948. A woman with a vision carried the future of modern art across a war-scarred Europe. But what if Peggy Guggenheim, the reluctant heiress turned collector of rebellion, had never built her museum on the Grand Canal? What worlds of beauty, or silence, might have followed? Welcome, dear listener. Wherever and whenever you join us, leave a note of your time and place below. Subscribe and let us drift together through this river of possibility. The story begins long before Venice, long before the echo of footsteps on marble and the glitter of light on the canal. It begins with a little girl in a gilded New York townhouse, born in 1898, surrounded by wealth and worry. Peggy Guggenheim came into a world of opulence that never managed to disguise its shadows. The Guggenheims were titans of industry, their fortune forged in copper and ambition. Yet even among the glittering chandeliers and imported rugs, there was an air of unease, as though the family wealth were a kind of velvet prison. Her father, Benjamin Guggenheim, adored her. He was gentle, charming, indulgent. When he left for Europe aboard the Titanic in 1912, Peggy was 13, still at the tender edge between child and woman. History tells us that he perished nobly, giving up his life jacket, facing the cold Atlantic like a gentleman. In this alternate world, the grief of that loss carves a deeper wound. The event does not propel her toward the bohemian adventure of her real life. It breaks something inside her, permanently. The young Peggy retreats from the world, clinging to the memory of a father she will never see again, to a world of certainty that the sea has swallowed. In our world, this loss planted the first seed of rebellion, the belief that everything stable could vanish overnight, and that life should therefore be lived as art. But in this other story, the grief does not transform, it calcifies. Peggy becomes a quiet observer, a young woman who learns to preserve rather than to provoke. She reads endlessly, studies philosophy, and withdraws from the social whirl of the young elite. When she inherits her fortune years later, she does not wander to Paris, nor seek the company of writers and dreamers. She donates modestly to hospitals and children's programs, believing she is doing her duty. The 1920s begin to hum around her, years of jazz, art, and rebellion, but Peggy listens to them as one might hear a party through a distant wall. In this silence, her restlessness grows. She feels the pulse of change, but cannot quite bring herself to join it. In another life, she would have met Marcel Duchamp in Paris, the man who would open the gates of modern art for her, teaching her to see beauty in absurdity. Here, that meeting never happens. Instead, Peggy corresponds briefly with a family acquaintance who runs a philanthropic society in London. She sends small donations, writes careful letters, and visits occasionally to attend lectures on women's education. The world moves without her. In Montparnasse, cafes overflow with artists who paint dreams, distortions, and fears. Brancusi sculpts the essence of flight. Ernst dreams of surreal landscapes. But Peggy's eyes are turned inward, away from this rising tide. She attends afternoon teas, hears of Gertrude Stein's salons, but finds them a little too loud, too clever. The avant-garde never finds its American heiress. The doors that would have opened through her curiosity remain closed, and the air behind them grows still. Her inheritance, meant to liberate her, becomes a kind of anchor. Her family, uneasy with her solitary habits, encourages her to marry. She does to a sensible young financier, a man more comfortable with balance sheets than canvases. Their home is polite, their dinners quiet, and the walls bare. Peggy decorates them not with art, but with photographs of gardens, as if to remind herself that beauty can be contained. Yet deep inside, there is the unspoken awareness that something is missing, that her life, though calm, hums with a faint dissonance, like a violin slightly out of tune. Sometimes she dreams of the sea, the same sea that took her father, and imagines herself standing on a Venetian balcony, the water glittering beneath her. In her dream, she holds a key in her hand, but never finds the door it belongs to. She wakes before the light changes, feeling as though history itself has passed her by. In the real world, Peggy's curiosity would have taken her to Paris and London, to artists struggling to redefine meaning after the Great War. She would have opened galleries, bought daring works, and rescued painters from obscurity. But here, in this gentler, quieter world, she becomes a benefactor of practical kindness, not imagination. Hospitals flourish under her quiet funding. A children's library in New York bears her name. Her letters are gracious but restrained, her friends respectable, her days meticulously ordered. Yet as the years move on, the echo of what might have been grows louder. By the late 1920s, the modern world is changing at a furious pace. The stock market trembles, women cut their hair short, and painters throw away their brushes. But in Peggy's house, time slows. She keeps a diary filled not with sketches or philosophies, but with observations about the weather, her garden, and the charities she supports. Still, she often pauses mid-sentence, as though expecting someone to walk in, an idea, a revelation, a spark. None comes. Occasionally, she visits a gallery purely out of politeness. The paintings seem strange, unrefined. She wonders why people admire such chaos. Perhaps, she writes once, I am simply not made for this new world. The irony, of course, is that she was meant to help build it. Without her, a small but vital chain of influence breaks. The artists who would have gathered under her wing never meet. Conversations never take place. Canvases remain unsold, unsent. The invisible network of creation, so dependent on chance and patronage, quietly shifts course. For now, the world still dances through the roaring 20s, unaware that a silent absence will soon echo across decades of art. And Peggy herself, now approaching 30, feels the faintest pull toward change, though she cannot name it. The city is restless. The newspapers hum with talk of modernism, surrealism, and revolution. She hears of women living freely in Paris, writers who speak of love as rebellion, painters who defy reason itself. Some evenings she sits by the window, imagining the sound of a distant cello playing through the streets of another country. Perhaps she wonders, without quite realizing it, what would happen if she followed that sound. But for now, the sea remains still, and the cello fades. The world waits, not knowing that one quiet woman's hesitation has already begun to alter its future. The tide retreats, and in the distance, the doors of history remain closed. For now. The years unfold like silk, soft, unhurried, almost translucent in their passing. Peggy Guggenheim enters the 1930s not as a legend in the making, but as a woman living a quiet, dutiful life within the measured rhythm of upper-class society. Her mornings are spent in correspondence, her afternoons at luncheons, her evenings reading under lamplight. In this alternate path, she is not yet the restless traveler of our remembered history, not yet the woman who would one day carry surrealism across the Atlantic. Instead, she is a careful presence in a world just beginning to fracture. It is 1931, and Europe trembles at the edges of uncertainty. In London and Paris, art is mutating into something unrecognizable. Picasso distorts Miro dreams, and young artists like Max Ernst craft strange universes from the subconscious. Yet the thread that once might have bound them to an American benefactor never forms. The Guggenheim name remains distant. The family concerned with business and banking, not with the invisible alchemy of paint and imagination. Peggy, now in her mid-30s, occasionally visits Europe, attending exhibitions more out of obligation than curiosity. She walks through galleries as though through a foreign language, polite but uncomprehending. When shown a sculpture by Brancusi, she admires its polish, but cannot sense its flight. "It's beautiful," she murmurs, "but I don't know what it means." The irony deepens. In the world we know, Marcel Duchamp would have stood beside her, gently explaining that not all meaning must be seen. He would have invited her into the invisible game of modernity, where ideas are art and art is rebellion. But their paths never cross. Peggy spends her London days among the well-bred and cautious, attending concerts and garden parties, where art is discussed as decorum, not destiny. She reads about surrealism in the papers with a mixture of amusement and disbelief. "Men dreaming on canvas," she writes in a letter to a friend. How curious. Had she opened a gallery then, as she did in our world, the history of modern art in Britain would have shifted profoundly. But in this imagined life, the door to Guggenheim Jeune, the small London gallery that once introduced Kandinsky and Cocteau to the English public, remains unopened. The avant-garde finds no ally among the old stone walls of Mayfair. Artists who might have thrived in Peggy's circle instead struggle for exposure. Abstract forms remain on the fringes, dismissed by critics as continental oddities. The British art world, deprived of her daring, lingers longer in the shadow of tradition. For Peggy herself, the absence becomes almost spiritual. She begins to sense, without naming it, the emptiness of a life that never truly intersected with creation. At dinner parties, she listens as others speak of markets, marriages, and empire, and feels as though she has drifted into a play she never auditioned for. Sometimes, walking alone through Kensington Gardens, she pauses by the Serpentine Lake, watching the gray sky reflected in its surface. The water reminds her of the Atlantic, the sea that once took her father and, perhaps, something of herself. There is always a low hum of restlessness within her, a feeling that something vital waits just beyond the horizon, unreachable but persistent. Meanwhile, across Europe, the currents of culture twist and collide. In Paris, André Breton writes of dreams as truth. In Germany, Bauhaus dissolves under political pressure. In Spain, a young painter named Salvador Dalí turns fear into spectacle. Yet Peggy remains a spectator, her fortune flowing toward hospitals and schools rather than the strange, subversive world of the imagination. In 1933, when she visits Paris for a charity conference, she walks past the very cafe where Duchamp and Man Ray are meeting. Inside, laughter spills over cigarette smoke and the smell of turpentine. Outside, Peggy pauses for a moment, sensing the warmth, the sound of ideas colliding like sparks, and then walks on. History exhales softly and lets her go. The doors of art remain closed to her, not by force but by hesitation. It is not that Peggy fears art, it is that she fears irrelevance, ridicule, the accusation of foolishness that so often follows women who defy convention. And so she waits. Her letters from this period reveal an acute awareness of what she calls a world waking into madness. She donates to relief efforts for refugees, writes careful essays on women's education, and maintains her place within polite society. Yet every so often, in a diary line or a passing remark, the yearning emerges. "I wonder," she writes one autumn evening, "if the world might one day grow too beautiful for us to understand." The thought lingers, and for a moment she imagines another version of herself, a version who might have stepped through that door, who might have gathered these strange, lonely artists and offered them sanctuary. But the thought fades, like mist. She turns the page, closes her journal, and prepares for bed. Beyond her quiet existence, the consequences of her absence ripple outward. The art world begins to solidify around different centers. Without her early patronage, the Surrealists remain a largely European phenomenon, less known in America. Collectors in New York continue to favor the Impressionists and the safe elegance of the old masters. The idea of art as rebellion, as psychological revelation, finds fewer allies across the Atlantic. The connection between Europe's fractured avant-garde and America's emerging identity weakens, and the great cultural exchange that might have flourished in the 1930s slows to a crawl. One might imagine a young American artist walking through a second-rate gallery in Manhattan, never encountering the daring forms that could have changed his life. He paints what sells, Portraits, landscapes, polite abstractions, never realizing that in another history, Peggy Guggenheim might have displayed his boldest experiment on a wall in London or New York, might have offered him a future. The absence of one woman's courage becomes a quiet vacuum in which countless small possibilities vanish. Still, the world moves forward, carried by forces larger than any one person. And yet, as history often reminds us, culture depends not only on genius, but on recognition, on those rare souls who open doors for others to walk through. In this altered world, those doors remain shut, their hinges untouched by Peggy's restless hands. As the 1930s darken, Europe begins to crack beneath the weight of its own anxieties. Economic despair breeds nationalism, and nationalism begins to devour the arts. The experimental and the eccentric are dismissed as degenerate. Galleries close, artists flee or hide. Without Peggy's haven, without her soon-to-be mythic courage in rescuing exiled artists, many find themselves stranded. But that belongs to the next turning of our tale. For now, the music of modernism plays on faintly in the distance, muffled behind the heavy walls of propriety. And Peggy, still in her quiet townhouse, hears the faint sound but does not yet rise to follow it. The door remains closed. The key lies untouched on her desk. And outside, the century begins to darken its voice, whispering of wars to come and of a world still waiting for the light that never arrived. The decade turns, and the air thickens with apprehension. Europe stands on a trembling threshold between beauty and ruin. Art, that fragile whisper of humanity's dreams, finds itself once more beneath the boots of power. And in this alternate world, where Peggy Guggenheim never lifted her hand to gather the scattered, something essential falters. The 1930s give way to a new kind of silence, one that is not born of ignorance, but of absence. The art world, deprived of her instinct for discovery, begins to harden around old habits. Museums cling to the past, collectors to their comfort, critics to their cynicism. The great experiment that might have bridged the old world and the new remains half-formed, suspended between continents like a ship lost in fog. Without Peggy's audacious energy, modern art in America grows timid. Her Art of This Century gallery, which in our world became the beating heart of the New York avant-garde, never exists here. The absence of that gallery, the platform where Pollock first dripped his defiance and where Rothko first drowned color and emotion, leaves a void in which no new voice rises. Abstract expressionism, that distinctly American flowering of existential modernism, never quite takes root. The critics who once sneered at its rawness find no one to challenge them. Galleries play it safe. Buyers prefer landscapes and portraits, art that flatters rather than confronts. The idea that painting could become a mirror of the soul, an act of liberation, remains a European eccentricity. Across the Atlantic, the artists who would have found shelter under Peggy's wing face bleaker fates. Many struggle to survive as political darkness gathers over Europe. Max Ernst, once her lover and collaborator, remains trapped in France, his surreal visions now deemed suspicious by the authorities. In our timeline, Peggy's intervention rescued him, bringing him to America where his work inspired a generation. But here, no telegram comes, no escape arranged. Ernst fades into obscurity, interned for years, his hands trembling from cold and hunger. He paints when he can, on scraps of paper, in cellars, on the backs of letters that will never be sent. His imagination becomes a private rebellion, unseen, unrecorded. Meanwhile, the surrealists scatter like startled birds. Dali retreats into self-promotion, Breton's movement loses coherence, and many artists, Jewish, foreign, or radical, find their voices muted by fear. Without the transatlantic refuge Peggy might have offered, countless works are lost, paintings burned, sculptures destroyed, ideas extinguished before they could evolve. The art world contracts, growing provincial again. What was once a chorus of experimentation becomes a series of isolated murmurs, each struggling to survive in a world turning blind to wonder. In New York, the Museum of Modern Art continues its mission, but something in its rhythm falters. It lacks that unpredictable energy, that human warmth that Peggy once brought to the movement. She was never a scholar nor a bureaucrat. She was a believer. Her intuition, her willingness to risk ridicule for beauty, gave the art world its necessary friction. Without her, MoMA becomes a temple of correctness rather than courage, curated by taste rather than love. The artists who might have thrived under her protection never find their audience. Some abandon painting altogether. Others conform to commercial trends, their fire dimmed by practicality. The art world, so dependent on patronage and passion, slowly forgets what it means to be alive. And what of Peggy herself? She lives quietly in London, watching the clouds gather over Europe. She is respected, even admired, as a thoughtful woman of means. She continues her philanthropy, funding hospitals as the political climate worsens. Yet in her private hours, there is a growing melancholy. The newspapers bring word of arrests, of exiles, of artists fleeing across borders. Their names, Chagall, Léger, Ernst, are familiar, though she knows them only distantly, as figures in a story she never entered. She reads of their struggles with a kind of trembling empathy, sensing that she might have done something, though she cannot quite say what. At night she dreams again of the sea, but now it is darker, restless, as though the waters themselves are keeping secrets. There are moments when fate seems to hesitate, offering her one more chance. A friend invites her to an exhibition of surrealist art in London, a small affair organized by exiles and dreamers. She attends out of politeness. The works are strange. Objects melting into one another, landscapes bending like smoke. She feels disturbed, intrigued, even faintly moved. For a moment she stands before a painting by Yves Tanguy, its soft grays and impossible forms whispering something to her, something she cannot name. But she shakes her head, unsure of herself, and leaves early. The door closes again, quietly. In the years that follow, the consequences deepen. Without Peggy's boldness, the artistic migration that defined mid-century modernism takes a different shape. Fewer European artists escape to America. Those who do find little support. The great fusion that might have occurred, the marriage of European surrealism with American vitality, never happens. Instead, the two continents drift apart culturally, as they soon will politically. The United States, deprived of its early modernist awakening, clings to its isolationism longer, its art mirroring its politics, inward-looking, suspicious of strangeness, wary of emotion. And in Europe, the war comes. Galleries close, collections vanish into warehouses or are looted. The dreams of modernity, those fragile attempts to make sense of chaos, are swallowed by real chaos. Peggy's absence, in this sense, is not merely symbolic, it becomes historical. Without her museum, without her daring acts of rescue, entire lineages of artistic thought disappear. Art becomes a casualty, not of censorship, but of forgetfulness. Yet through all this, one cannot help but imagine the quiet tragedy of her unfulfilled potential. Perhaps she reads an article about a gallery destroyed by bombing and feels a pang she cannot explain. Perhaps she senses, deep within, that her life was meant for something beyond charity, that her truest philanthropy might have been beauty itself. But the moment passes. The war comes closer. She moves to the countryside for safety. Her days are filled with rationing, correspondence, and the small heroism of endurance. The sea she once dreamed of seeing again becomes a boundary rather than a promise. In this alternate world, the art of the 20th century takes on a different hue, less daring, less haunted, less human. Without the bridge between continents that Peggy once embodied, Europe and America each tell their stories alone. The world learns to rebuild its cities, but not always its imagination. And somewhere, in the quiet of her English garden, Peggy sits with her tea, listening to the distant hum of airplanes overhead, unaware that the century has already forgotten her name. The fog thickens, both over London and over the timeline itself. The next years will bring not only destruction, but an unthinkable loss. The erasure of art's witness to suffering, of color's defiance against darkness. In our real world, Peggy would have crossed borders, rescued artists, and planted seeds for a new age. But here, she stays, motionless, as history gathers its storm. The storm approaches, though at first it whispers rather than roars. The 1930s bleed into the 1940s, and Europe feels like a theater of ghosts. The air is filled with smoke from furnaces and fear, and the streets hum with the sound of boots, slogans, and silence. In this alternate world where Peggy Guggenheim has remained a distant observer rather than a daring conspirator in art's evolution, the continent's creative heart begins to falter. The avant-garde, once bright with rebellion and laughter, retreats into the shadows. The cafes of Paris grow emptier, the studios of Montparnasse stand half-lit and hushed. Artists who once painted their nightmares now live them. Those who could have escaped through the network of courage and friendship Peggy built in another history find the doors closed and the papers unsigned. The absence of one woman's vision cannot stop a war, but it can shift the paths of souls. In this version of events, the young painter Leonora Carrington never finds the means to flee France. Max Ernst, the man she loved, remains imprisoned without Peggy's intervention. His letters are never delivered, his release never secured. Carrington, abandoned and traumatized, loses her sanity in Spain, her brilliance fading into the mist of memory. Surrealism, which once embodied the dream of freedom through imagination, becomes instead a collection of fractured memories, an art of mourning rather than hope. And in London, Peggy reads about the war and shudders. She sends donations to refugee programs, organizes collections for the Red Cross, and feels, without quite knowing why, that she is helping shadows rather than people. The old artistic capitals are silenced one by one. Berlin's galleries are emptied under the gaze of the Reich. Paris, that great sanctuary of art, is hollowed out as painters and poets scatter. Many of those who could have fled to America through Peggy's network, through her contacts, her impulsive generosity, are caught instead in the tightening net of war. Entire schools of thought vanish into the smoke. The Surrealist manifesto, once a hymn to liberty, becomes contraband. The lines between politics and poetry dissolve in the ruins. The dream that the human mind could transcend its horrors through creation collapses under the weight of its own helplessness. And so, Europe, before the storm truly breaks, stands still in an uncanny quiet. The salons are gone, the conversations have ceased. What remains is fear and longing, the two elements that paradoxically once inspired art's most courageous expressions. Yet without the patrons, without the bridges, without those rare figures like Peggy who could transform admiration into action, this longing turns inward. Artists paint in secrecy, or not at all. Some hide their works behind false walls, others bury them in gardens, unsure whether the future will ever be kind enough to see them. It is as though the century holds its breath. In this altered world, Peggy spends those same years in rural England, tending her garden as the sirens wail. She has no museum to protect, no collection to rescue. The works she might have saved are ashes elsewhere. Her life is quieter, safer, and somehow smaller. She writes letters to friends who are already gone, believing they might still be alive somewhere. Occasionally, she opens her old journals and rereads her early reflections. Those hesitant words about beauty, about duty, about how one should serve the world. Now they seem naive, almost childish. She feels a pang of guilt, though she cannot trace its origin. Perhaps it is the guilt of survival, or perhaps something deeper, the intuition that she has lived a life adjacent to meaning. The war, in its grim progression, turns even art into a weapon. Propaganda replaces poetry. Official murals replace paintings of protest. Music marches in rhythm with armies. Beauty is conscripted, and imagination becomes dangerous. The concept of the artist as a free being, one accountable only to truth, erodes beneath censorship and fear. Those who manage to escape Europe find themselves in exile, spiritually homeless. In America, where Peggy's influence might have provided them sanctuary, their presence goes largely unnoticed. The cultural exchange that defined the mid-20th century in our history, the fusion of European anguish with American vitality, never takes form. The United States, pragmatic and victorious, treats art as luxury, not necessity. And yet, amid this darkness, there are flickers of what might have been. In 1942, in our real timeline, Peggy Guggenheim opened Art of This Century in New York, a gallery that became a kind of ark for modern art, where the exiled surrealists mingled with young American painters searching for a new language. In this imagined world, there is no such ark. The flood comes, but there is no vessel waiting. Without that meeting ground, without that creative friction, the evolution of art slows to a crawl. Abstract expressionism, surrealism's successor, never quite emerges. The dialogue between continents remains unfinished. The silence that began with her hesitation now expands across the globe, not as an absence of noise, but as an absence of meaning. By the time the war ends, the damage is not only material, but spiritual. Europe has lost not just its cities and lives, but its sense of cultural continuity. The museums that survive are filled with ghosts, rooms of absence where entire movements should have hung. Venice, Paris, Berlin, Vienna, all still beautiful, but with a beauty that feels like mourning. And in that quiet aftermath, Peggy, still alive, still wealthy, still capable, feels an ache she cannot name. She travels briefly to Italy, finding the country she once dreamed of a decade earlier, now hollowed by defeat. She walks along the canals of Venice, past the very palazzo that, in another world, would have become her museum. The building stands empty, its windows shuttered, its walls flaking with age. She lingers before it, watching the light ripple across the water, sensing, without understanding, that she is standing before her own unrealized destiny. She returns to England soon after, haunted by the vision. The war is ending, but the silence remains. Across Europe, artists begin again, hesitantly, painfully, but their works are fractured, filled with ghosts and shadows. There is no unifying force, no gathering of voices, no woman on the Grand Canal declaring that art must live again. In her absence, art becomes something private, fragmentary, a whisper instead of a song, and thus the storm passes, but it leaves behind a continent of ruins, and among them a woman who does not yet realize that her own life's purpose has already washed away with the tide. The sea that once promised renewal now reflects only the fading colors of what might have been. The war no longer rumbles in the distance. It has arrived in full, swallowing borders, cities, and memory itself. Across Europe, the sound of trains replaces the sound of conversation, and art becomes one more casualty of necessity. The world that once seemed endless in possibility narrows into fear and hunger. It is in these years that Peggy Guggenheim's absence becomes not just symbolic, but tragic. For in the world we know, she was a rescuer, a woman who transformed her wealth into a lifeline for artists marked by tyranny. But in this alternate unfolding, there is no Guggenheim in Marseille arranging escape papers, no shipments of paintings smuggled across borders, no frantic race to preserve beauty from annihilation. There is only the steady erosion of culture under the weight of war, a slow unmaking of everything that once shimmered with imagination. Max Ernst languishes in confinement, painting small fragments on scraps of cardboard, visions of flight that can never take wing. His letters written to no one, describe dreams of escape to a place he calls the country of unreason, a name that might once have been America, but no invitation comes, no benefactress arrives to ransom him from oblivion. Leonora Carrington, shattered by loss, drifts into madness and isolation. André Breton, the high priest of Surrealism, finds himself increasingly desperate, his movement disintegrating into exile and bitterness. Without the invisible network of care Peggy wove across borders, these artists, once beacons of modern thought, become displaced wanderers in a continent where creation itself is a crime. In New York, the mood is different, but not necessarily brighter. The war seems distant, and with it, the suffering of artists who could have transformed the American imagination. In the real timeline, the arrival of these refugees, brought by Peggy's intervention, ignited the explosion of abstract expressionism, the first truly American art movement of the century. But here, the seed never takes root. Pollock remains an unknown drifter, a laborer in a museum workshop, occasionally sketching but never encouraged. The circle of young painters who once gathered in her gallery, Rothko, Motherwell, Basiotti, remain isolated figures, each trapped in private struggles against poverty and anonymity. Without a space like Art of this Century, there is no meeting point, no collision of vision and mentorship, no moment where Europe's ghosts and America's restlessness could merge into revelation. The consequence is not immediate catastrophe, but a thinning of spirit. The cultural heartbeat slows. American art remains provincial, a follower rather than an innovator. Europe's modernism dies in its birthplace, unable to transplant itself to new soil. And through all this, Peggy herself drifts quietly through wartime England, her existence modest and unrecorded. She volunteers for relief organizations, folds bandages, writes careful letters of condolence. Her neighbors admire her composure, her discretion. No one suspects that beneath her calm exterior, something unfulfilled has begun to ache like a phantom limb. Sometimes she dreams of Venice again. In these dreams, she is standing before a building by the water, a pale, unfinished palace. The windows are empty, the marble cracked, yet there is light moving inside, the kind that suggests life. In the dream, she tries to open the door, but her hand passes through the handle as though it were smoke. She wakes with the sound of waves in her ears, unsure whether it was memory or prophecy. The war continues, and Europe becomes a gallery of ruins. Churches crumble, libraries burn, and with them the records of entire generations of artists who will never be remembered. Without the systematic preservation efforts that collectors like Peggy once led, thousands of works vanish into black markets or destruction. Museums sell or lose what they cannot hide. Paintings are repurposed as covers for supply crates or traded for food. Sculptures are melted down for metal. Beauty becomes survival's currency, and imagination, a risk. When the Allied forces finally push through, victory feels hollow. There is a relief, but also a strange emptiness. In the cities newly liberated, artists crawl from hiding places, blinking into daylight, unsure whether they still belong to this world. The post-war exhibitions that once rekindled hope in Paris and New York are never organized. The great surveys of modern art that were meant to reintroduce humanity to itself never occur. Instead, each country rebuilds its own narrative in isolation. The international language of art, its ability to translate suffering into unity, has been lost. And yet amid the devastation, there are faint murmurs of what could have been. A few surviving painters in Paris try to reopen their studios, scrounging for canvas. They remember rumors of an American woman who once supported artists like them, though in this world she never truly existed in that form. The legend of Peggy Guggenheim becomes a whisper of what the world needed and did not receive. The figure of a patron who might have bridged the gulf between despair and renewal. Some artists even paint her from imagination, an anonymous benefactor, a spirit of modernity who was supposed to arrive but never did. In the ruins of Montparnasse, such myths feel necessary. Peggy, now in her 40s, reads of the war's end with a sigh that is almost shame. She does not know why she feels it. After all, she has lived correctly, even nobly by the measures of her time. She has helped the wounded, given generously, kept her integrity. And yet one quiet evening, as she walks along a riverbank, she realizes that she has left nothing that will outlast her. Her life feels like a house without echoes. The thought does not embitter her. It simply settles into her like the slow gathering of dusk. In the following months, she receives an invitation from an acquaintance to visit Venice. The city has survived, though scarred and weary. She travels there, partly from curiosity, partly from longing for something unnamed. When she arrives, she feels a shiver of recognition, the scent of the sea, the golden light on the canals, the faint music drifting from open windows. She stays at a modest pensione near the Grand Canal, not far from the palazzo she once saw in her dream. Passing by it again, she pauses. The gate is still locked, but ivy has begun to grow around its stone. She lingers for a long while, then walks away. The world rebuilds itself, though without the spark of renewal that art once gave it. Museums reopen, but with caution, their curators preferring the safety of the classical. The word modern becomes tainted, associated with chaos, rebellion, and pain. The young are drawn to entertainment rather than expression. Governments invest in propaganda rather than experimentation. The result is a piece that feels strangely airless, a beauty too polished, too afraid of truth. The shadow of war remains not only on the walls, but in the imagination itself. And Peggy, unaware that she could have changed all of this, boards a train back to England as evening falls. She looks once more out the window at the fading lagoon, where the water catches the last amber light. For a brief moment, she thinks she sees something flicker in the reflection, an image of herself standing before that palazzo, not as she is, but as she might have been, bold, alive, surrounded by canvases and laughter. Then the train enters a tunnel, and the vision disappears. Outside, the continent exhales after years of terror, but its silence carries a new kind of loss, the loss of the unmade, the unseen, the unrealized. The shadow of war stretches far beyond the battlefield into the corridors of memory where every absence is also a question. What beauty might have lived had one woman chosen differently? The war ends and the world stands blinking beneath a pale new light, the kind that comes after long storms, cold, uncertain, and somehow too bright. Europe, exhausted and scarred, tries to recall how to breathe. America, untouched in its cities but changed in its spirit, begins to believe itself the new keeper of civilization. Yet something essential is missing, something invisible but vital, the restless pulse of modern art that might have defined this era differently. The tide that once carried Europe's artistic daring to New York never crests here, because Peggy Guggenheim never brought it. There are no galleries pulsing with foreign voices, no new languages of form being born. The post-war American art scene becomes cautious, domestic, and strangely obedient, painting the world not as it is, but as people wish it still were. In the early 1940s, a young man named Jackson Pollock walks down a Manhattan street, his hands stained with turpentine, his rent overdue. He paints, but without encouragement, his style remains constrained, hesitant. There is no Peggy to discover him, no space like Art of This Century, where he can splatter his chaos across the wall and call it truth. In another history, she would have looked at his canvases and seen something divine in their disorder, offering him not only money, but permission. Without that moment, Pollock continues to drink, taking work as an assistant in a commercial studio, designing abstract backgrounds for department store displays. His talent dissolves quietly into anonymity. Rothko teaches art to children in a Brooklyn community center. Motherwell writes, "Criticism no one reads." De Kooning repairs furniture. Each one burns with the sense that something is happening somewhere, but they cannot find it. The collectors, left without Peggy's daring example, retreat to the safety of the familiar. The Museum of Modern Art in New York curates its exhibitions with restraint, its directors wary of risk. European surrealism remains a curiosity, admired from afar but not embraced. The United States, in its post-war confidence, prefers clarity and optimism, paintings of industry, landscapes of progress, portraits of comfort. Art becomes decoration, not defiance. Critics describe this era as stable, but it is a sterile stability, the calm of conformity. Without the rebellion that modern art once carried, America's cultural imagination settles into order. Beauty becomes symmetrical, and the strange is left unspoken. Peggy Guggenheim, living now in semi-retirement in London, reads of America's new wealth and its cultural ambitions. She attends lectures at the Royal Academy, visits museums that are repairing their bomb damage, and writes polite letters to friends in the art world she never entered. She is 50 and still restless, though she no longer calls it that. Sometimes she sits in her garden, closing her eyes and imagining the world as it might have been. What if she had gone to Paris? What if she had dared to open a gallery? What if she had believed that beauty was worth the risk of ridicule? She rarely speaks these thoughts aloud, but her eyes betray them, soft and searching, as if she can almost see the ghosts of the paintings she never collected. Meanwhile, the broader current of art history shifts towards something colder. Without the emotional upheaval of abstract expressionism, mid-century modernism becomes architectural rather than personal. Steel and glass replace paint and flesh. The buildings of Mies van der Rohe and the urban grids of post-war planners define modernity not as passion, but as precision. The city becomes a museum of efficiency. It is not that art dies, it simply forgets how to feel. In coffeehouses and classrooms, students speak of technique instead of revelation. The language of art becomes analytic, the artist's soul buried beneath manifestos. In this new order, the museum Peggy never built in Venice becomes a symbol of absence. The Palazzo Venier de Leoni remains unfinished, its empty facade facing the canal like a wound that never healed. Visitors pass by it unaware that, in another history, it would have become a sanctuary for color, for rebellion, for memory. The gondoliers call it the Sleeping Palace, and at dusk, its reflection in the water looks like a face half submerged. Only a few old Venetians remember the rumor of the American woman who once admired it, who stood before it for a long moment and then walked away. They tell the story as though it were a fable about chance, the choices that never ripened, the dreams that waited too long. Across the ocean, a young nation loses the opportunity to define its artistic voice through honesty. Without the wildness Peggy would have nurtured, America's art becomes obedient to markets and governments. When the Cold War begins, culture turns into a tool of persuasion. Paintings must serve patriotism or commerce. The CIA funds exhibitions of modern art abroad, but it is modernity without heart, a campaign rather than a movement. What had once been rebellion becomes strategy. And so, what might have been a fire is reduced to a flicker, controlled and contained. Peggy hears of these developments with a peculiar ache. She does not think of politics or movements, only of what might have been if she had done something, anything different. She sometimes dreams of rooms filled with color, of strangers whose names she somehow knows: Pollock, Rothko, Ernst. She sees them smiling at her across a gallery, thanking her without words. But when she wakes, there is only silence and the gray light of London seeping through her curtains. As the years turn, the art world evolves without her, but its evolution feels incomplete, as if a chord were missing from the song. The daring that once defined the 20th century's creative explosion arrives only in fragments. Experimental cinema takes up some of the slack, literature too. Writers like Beckett and Nabokov captured the absurdity that painters might have rendered, but painting itself becomes cautious. It remains a language spoken fluently but without conviction. The great confrontation between humanity and abstraction, emotion and form, never fully takes place. The century, robbed of that dialogue, grows quieter in spirit, more rational but less alive. And so, as 1950 approaches, Peggy Guggenheim becomes one of many forgotten heiresses who lived well and died gently. History barely remembers her name, except in the margins of genealogies. The world does not know what it has lost. In this alternate story, she never builds a museum, never rescues a generation, never bridges two continents. Yet in the stillness of her later years, as she watches the sun dip behind the English trees, there are moments when she senses that the world feels strangely unfinished, as if something vital was left undone. The air holds a faint echo of laughter in a gallery, of the hum of Venice at twilight, of paintings leaning against a wall waiting to be seen. She cannot name the feeling, but she lives with it, as though carrying a dream she forgot to tell. And beyond her, across oceans and cities, the century itself carries the same sensation, that of a door left closed, a light never switched on. The tide of innovation ebbs, leaving behind a shore of restraint. Art becomes polite once more, and the modern world, though prosperous, feels a little colder. It is a peace without imagination, a progress without poetry. And somewhere, beneath the noise of it all, there lingers the quiet question that history never answers. What might have changed had one woman in Venice decided to open that door? The years after the war unfold like a slow exhalation. Venice, scarred but still luminous, becomes a city of echoes, its beauty unbroken yet hollow, its light glancing off facades that remember too much. In this world, Peggy Guggenheim never claims the Palazzo Venier de Leoni, never fills its bare rooms with the defiant colors of a reborn century. The building remains what it always was meant to be before she arrived, a half-completed relic, a structure that stopped growing in the 18th century and never found its purpose again. It sits quietly on the Grand Canal, its windows blind to the shimmer of the water, its marble worn by decades of neglect. Visitors glide past it, whispering of its incompleteness, never knowing that in another thread of time it could have become a beacon, a home for all the exiled dreams of modern art. The city itself is caught between mourning and rebirth. Tourists begin to return by the early 1950s, bringing laughter back to the piazzas, yet something in Venice feels arrested, as if time here resists moving forward. The war left not only ruins but a strange inertia, a reluctance to imagine again. In our true world, Peggy's arrival and her decision to fill that unfinished palace with paintings would have transformed Venice into a place where the past met the future, where Titian's saints shared the same light as Kandinsky's abstraction. But in this shadowed timeline, the canal reflects only what it always has, the fading splendor of empire and memory. The palazzo remains closed, the sound of its silence like a pulse, muffled by water. Across Europe, museums are reopening, but they cling to their old hierarchies. The avant-garde, denied its Venetian sanctuary, disperses into obscurity. The few surviving surrealists live in small apartments in Paris, aging quietly, their paintings rarely exhibited. The younger generation of artists grows restless but lacks direction. Their influences are fragmented, scattered by war and indifference. Without the myth of the Guggenheim collection, without that miraculous convergence of Picasso, Ernst, Brancusi, Pollock, and Arp gathered in one place, the idea of modern art as a universal conversation never takes hold. The world's creativity fractures into regional dialects, each speaking softly to itself. Peggy, now older, visits Venice once more in 1951. She walks slowly along the canal, her steps steady but unhurried. her gaze lingering on the water as though searching for a reflection she cannot name. The city seems to recognize her, the way old friends sometimes do after years of separation, without words, with a kind of melancholic affection. She stops before the Palazzo Venier dei Leoni again. The façade is streaked with algae, its doors still locked. A thin mist curls along the canal, and in that moment she feels a tug, a sensation of something unfinished, a calling that has long been ignored. For a fleeting second, she imagines what it might be like to live there, to fill those rooms with paintings, to open the doors to the public and let light flow in. But the thought fades almost as soon as it appears. The war is over, the world is tired, and she has learned to quiet her dreams. She walks away, unaware that history itself seems to sigh behind her. Venice without the Guggenheim Museum remains a city of exquisite nostalgia. Painters still come, of course, they always have, but they come as tourists, not pilgrims. There is no place here where the old and new embrace, no palace where the ghosts of modernism can find shelter. The Biennale continues its exhibitions, but without Peggy's influence, its selections are cautious, conventional. The avant-garde remains peripheral, tolerated, but never celebrated. Visitors stroll through galleries filled with polite modernity, unaware of the alternate world that might have been, the one where Venice became the crossroads of imagination rather than its reflection. For Peggy herself, the years grow quieter. She divides her time between London and Switzerland, occasionally traveling for health and solitude. Her letters grow sparse, her friendships fewer. She reads the newspapers, seeing the names of artists she might have known, those who, in another reality, filled her collection. But they are faint ghosts here, brief mentions in obituaries or retrospectives. The art world begins to move on without her, inventing new heroes, new patrons. She watches from afar, curious but detached, as though observing a play whose dialogue she once memorized but never performed. Sometimes she dreams again of that Venetian palace. In the dream, it is no longer empty. The rooms are alive with color, paintings leaning against the walls, sculptures poised in conversation with light. She walks through them, feeling a strange familiarity, as if she has finally come home. But when she wakes, there is only her quiet English room, the ticking of the clock, the sound of rain against glass. The vision lingers, half real, half regret. She begins to think that perhaps some choices are not erased, but simply live elsewhere, in another version of time, continuing without her. In Venice, the palazzo decays slowly but beautifully. Its owner, a distant relative of an old family, keeps it closed to the public. The building becomes a kind of local legend, the unfinished palace, a metaphor for the city itself, eternally incomplete, eternally dreaming. Poets write about it. Photographers capture its symmetry, but no one restores it, no one gives it purpose. The absence of Peggy's vision transforms it into something haunting, a monument not to art's survival, but to its hesitation. Gondoliers tell stories to visitors, saying that the palace is cursed by indecision, that anyone who enters will forget what they came for. They do not know how close they are to truth. Meanwhile, across the world, the story of modern art takes a different path. The center of gravity shifts to Paris again, but without the infusion of American energy, it fades into mannerism and nostalgia. New York, deprived of its early spark, never becomes the capital of art. Its galleries remain provincial, its museums conservative. The dialogue between continents, the pulse that once defined the 20th century's creative revolution, never finds its rhythm. By the time the 1960s arrive, a generation of artists is born into a world without daring lineage. They look backward, not forward, their canvases echoing styles from decades past. Innovation becomes a whisper rather than a declaration. And through it all, Venice remains still. The Palazzo Venier dei Leoni stands as it always has, low and horizontal, gazing across the water toward the church of Santa Maria della Salute. Its marble facade, once white as bone, has turned the color of pale honey in the sun. Each evening, the last light slides across its surface and vanishes into the canal, as though the day itself is bowing before an altar of what might have been. It is beautiful, yes, but its beauty is heavy, a beauty of silence, of waiting. Sometimes, visitors standing by the water's edge think they see a figure at the balcony, a woman in black watching the boats drift by. The locals say it is the ghost of the heiress who never came, the one who should have built her museum but left instead. She is said to appear only at twilight, when the air smells of salt and thyme, her gaze turned toward the horizon as if expecting someone, or perhaps herself, to return. There is something almost sacred in the silence of the palazzo as it continues to stand, untouched, year after year. The air inside smells faintly of dust and salt, and when the tide rises high, the floor sighs with water beneath the marble. The city moves around it, gondolas gliding, footsteps echoing across bridges, but within its walls, time lingers, thick and heavy. If one were to walk through its shuttered halls, one might imagine faint outlines where paintings could have hung, where sculptures could have stood, where light could have played across canvases that were never brought into being. This stillness is not merely physical. It is the stillness of an opportunity that the world has quietly forgotten. Venice has become again what it once was, a relic of beauty without renewal, a city preserved rather than lived in. Art deprived of its Venetian sanctuary loses something ineffable. Patronage, that delicate thread binding creators to their champions, weakens with each passing decade. In the centuries before, nobles and princes had supported artists to glorify power. Peggy's generation was meant to invert that, to use wealth not to dominate beauty, but to free it. Without her as the living example of that transformation, the act of patronage itself becomes commercial again. Collectors emerge, but their motives shift. Art becomes investment, not devotion. The painting ceases to be a conversation and becomes a commodity, a sign of prestige rather than wonder. In this subtle but devastating change, the very soul of creation bends toward the marketplace. What was once love becomes transaction. It is in this age of acquisition that the ghosts begin to stir. Not the ghosts of the dead, but of the unseen, the works never bought, the artists never saved, the voices never heard. They move invisibly through the world, haunting the spaces where art should have spoken. In New York, where once the Guggenheim collection would have drawn restless minds and critics eager to witness a new era, the galleries remain quiet, their walls adorned with tame abstractions that echo older masters without daring to challenge them. In Paris, the avant-garde survives in basements and attics, painting for no one, speaking to walls. The vitality of human imagination, which in our world burned through post-war gloom like a torch, flickers instead in corners where no one looks. Peggy herself feels this absence, though she cannot name it. In her later years, she becomes a figure of near anonymity, respected for her philanthropy, admired for her taste in literature, but forgotten by the movement she never joined. Her life has become composed of small, dignified gestures, supporting libraries, attending classical concerts, funding student scholarships. She smiles politely at receptions, though her eyes often drift toward the paintings on the walls. Safe landscapes, soft portraits, comfortable art. It soothes others, but not her. She feels deep within a kind of hunger she has long mistaken for restlessness. It is the hunger of imagination unrealized. Sometimes she wonders, as she listens to Bach's cello suites, whether her father would have approved of her quiet life, her good name unsullied, her fortune spent wisely. She tells herself he would, and yet sometimes, in the long quiet after the music ends, she weeps without knowing why. Outside her own life, the world begins to notice what it has lost. By the late 1950s, critics speak of a cultural fatigue. The art of the modern world, they say, has become clever but cold, technical but bloodless. Painters compete for novelty rather than meaning, galleries for profit rather than revelation. There are exhibitions that dazzle, but none that move. Some writers blame the times, television, technology, the rush of the century, but others sense that something deeper has gone missing, a human warmth that once connected artists to patrons and patrons to purpose. Had Peggy built her museum, that warmth might have endured, that conversation might have continued. The act of collecting would still carry something sacred, the faith that beauty, even when incomprehensible, deserves to be protected simply because it exists. Venice, in its timeless way, seems to embody this loss. The Palazzo Venier dei Leoni remains abandoned but strangely serene, as though aware of its role as custodian of forgotten possibilities. Locals say that sometimes, when the air is very still and the canal reflects the moon like a sheet of glass, faint colors appear in its windows, shadows of paintings that never came to be. Those who pass by speak of figures in motion, flashes of blue and red, outlines of human forms dissolving into light. They vanish when approached, but the memory lingers. It is said that the palace dreams on behalf of the world, keeping alive the memory of what beauty might have been. Art historians decades later would speak of the 1950s and 1960s as the age when creativity became institutionalized, when museums grew larger and colder, and artists learned to negotiate rather than transcend. They would say that the personal disappeared from art, that the world forgot how to risk love for a painting, and all of it, they might have realized, stemmed from a missing link in the chain of faith. A woman who might have made art human again, but instead chose discretion over defiance. History often turns on such fragile hinges. In her 70s now, Peggy visits Venice one last time. Her health is delicate, but her curiosity has not entirely vanished. She arrives quietly, avoiding attention, and takes a small apartment near the Rialto. The city smells of rain and stone. On her second day, she walks once more to the Grand Canal. The palazzo stands there, unchanged, its walls bathed in late afternoon light. She stands before it for a long time, her breath shallow, her eyes fixed not on the building, but on the play of water at its base. For a moment, she feels as though time itself has paused to let her decide once more. But the decision is no longer hers. The world she might have altered has already unfolded without her. She turns away, and as she does, a faint breeze stirs across the canal, rippling the water, scattering the reflection of the palace into fragments. The ghosts of patronage linger in that motion. The invisible lives altered by choices unmade, the art unbought, the futures untold. And in that gentle stirring, there is something almost merciful, a reminder that even absence leaves an imprint, that the world remembers what could have been, even when it cannot name it. The palazzo remains silent, yet in its silence lies a strange kind of testimony, as if the very stones whisper, all beauty begins as a possibility. Across the quiet world of the 1960s, the art that might have been never quite materializes, and the names that might have been remembered fade before they are spoken. In our history, Peggy Guggenheim gave shape to the myth of discovery, the woman who found voices before the world knew how to listen. But here, in this alternate strand, the myth dissolves. There are no legends of an American heiress discovering pollock in a barn, no stories of her defending the chaotic genius of a man everyone else dismissed as drunk or unstable. There is only the slow drift of lost potential, as artists who could have defined a century instead fall into the cracks of anonymity. Jackson Pollock dies early in this world too, but not as a prophet of the new or a symbol of transcendence. He dies in obscurity, a man whose canvases never escaped his garage. His death, when reported at all, is a small notice in a local paper: painter, killed in car crash. There is no legacy, no movement, no imitators. The drip, that private chaos that in another world redefined the act of painting itself, remains an accident no one witnesses. Mark Rothko grows old in poverty, teaching children how to mix colors, never finding that luminous melancholy that would have made his name eternal. He paints smaller works for church walls and libraries, each one heavy with the sense of a meaning just beyond reach. Without Peggy's unwavering belief in his emotional gravity, his art remains unanchored. Willem de Kooning works as a decorator into his 50s before arthritis ends his craft. All of them, in this timeline, share the same quiet fate. They create, but no one answers. And Europe fares no better. Without the exiled surrealists inspiring the next generation, the movement dies with its founders. Max Ernst, broken by imprisonment and loss, ceases to paint after the war. Leonora Carrington disappears into seclusion. André Breton continues to write manifestos that few read. By the time the 1960s arrive, surrealism is a relic, a memory of an age when people still believed imagination could change the world. Without its rebirth through Peggy's patronage, it never crosses the Atlantic to inspire the boldness of others. The art that follows in its place feels technical, cautious, safe. Critics call it refined. Poets call it lifeless. The loss is invisible, but vast. What the century loses is not merely the art itself, but the confidence to believe that art could still matter. A world without the Guggenheim Museum in Venice, without Peggy's collection as a sanctuary for the displaced and the daring, becomes a world where artists doubt their purpose. The private spaces that once encouraged rebellion are replaced by institutions that measure value through attendance and sales. Aesthetic courage gives way to calculation. The artist, once a seer, becomes an employee of culture, and yet the longing for something deeper never vanishes. Here and there, isolated individuals attempt to reclaim what was lost. A young painter in Rome named Lucio Fontana slashes his canvases open, trying to find spirit in destruction. A sculptor in Madrid works secretly, creating twisted forms that speak of war's lingering wounds. A few poets write as though art still carries moral weight. But none of them find the audience they need, for the web of connection that Peggy once would have spun across continents never forms. The world becomes a collection of lonely geniuses, each shining briefly in isolation. Peggy herself, now in her 80s, hears faint rumors of these new artists in newspapers or journals, but seldom follows them. She has grown into her solitude gracefully, her days slow and dignified. Her friends have mostly died, her letters grow shorter. Occasionally, she revisits old notebooks, their pages yellowed by time. In them, she finds the traces of what she once dreamed of doing, mentions of artists she had admired in youth, fragments of correspondence from acquaintances in Paris or New York she never pursued. She reads them as one might read another person's life, with gentle disbelief. "I was almost brave once," she writes on a loose scrap of paper and sets it aside without sadness. In New York, the void her absence left becomes increasingly apparent. The city has wealth, but no soul. Its galleries are polished, its collectors disciplined, its critics articulate, but there is no center, no pulse. Art is admired, not lived. It decorates apartments rather than changes minds. The bohemian energy that once electrified the post-war generation never takes hold. The artists who should have challenged convention become craftsmen of fashion. The city becomes known for commerce rather than creation, and culture settles comfortably into the hands of those who can afford it. By the 1970s, the world has changed beyond recognition. Space travel, television, nuclear power, all the symbols of progress have arrived, but the emotional vocabulary that modern art once promised remains incomplete. The human spirit feels curiously underrepresented in its own era. The art that should have reflected the century's uncertainty instead hides from it. Without the fierce honesty of the abstract expressionists, without the haunting introspection of Rothko, or the violent purity of Pollock, the world drifts toward spectacle, rather than substance. The museums that should have housed revelation become theaters for distraction. And in Venice, the Palazzo Venier dei Leoni continues to sleep. The ivy climbs higher, the steps crumble a little more each year. At sunset, the water glows orange, and the empty palace glows with it, a ghost lit from within. To passing travelers, it seems simply one of many beautiful ruins the city possesses, another monument to something that might have been magnificent. But the locals know better. They say the building dreams for all of them, that it contains within its stones the ache of unfulfilled art, the sigh of all those who were not remembered. At night, gondoliers crossing the canal claim to hear faint music from its windows, not quite melody, not quite memory, as if the ghosts of painters still whisper there, asking to be seen. In the quiet rooms of her English house, Peggy sometimes feels the same whisper. She cannot name it, but she knows it well. It is the sound of unrealized beauty, the hum of a life that could have mattered differently. She smiles when she hears it now. There is no bitterness left in her, only recognition. The world, she thinks, always forgets something precious. Perhaps this forgetting is the price of progress, the shadow that follows every age of invention. And perhaps, though she never built her museum, she has still carried within her the faint echo of what might have been, a memory so deep it becomes part of the silence itself. The ghosts of art continue to drift through the world. They move quietly through galleries, through empty studios, through the dreams of young painters who cannot explain the ache they feel when faced with an empty canvas. It is not grief, exactly. It is remembrance. It is the faint awareness that once, somewhere, there was meant to be a gathering place for courage and color, for rebellion and tenderness, and that someone was meant to open its doors. In their absence, the ghosts remain faithful, waiting, as all beauty waits, for someone to see it at last. The 20th century moves onward, glittering and uncertain, and the echo of what never came to be grows fainter, but no less real. By the early 1970s, the world of art has changed its face entirely. Museums rise in every great city, temples of glass and concrete that proclaim civilization's endurance, but they are strangely sterile, repositories rather than revolutions. The spark that once ignited from the meeting of daring spirits, the unpredictable chemistry between artist and believer, is gone. Without Peggy Guggenheim's example, the woman who in another world would have transformed the personal into the universal, the very idea of the private museum as an act of love does not exist. The great institutions that appear in her place are monuments to administration, their walls immaculate, their curators cautious. They collect, but they do not feel. In America, the Museum of Modern Art becomes an emblem of order rather than adventure. Its exhibitions celebrate the manageable and the already approved. The radical edges of creation are trimmed away before they reach the public. The few remaining collectors follow its lead, treating art as investment portfolios. The phrase art world begins to acquire a faintly ironic tone, something organized, self-contained, and safe. In Europe, the situation mirrors this calm sterility. Paris rebuilds its museums as symbols of national continuity. London renovates its galleries, bathing Turner and Constable in new light, but leaving little space for the strange and the new. And in Venice, where the Palazzo Venier dei Leoni could have stood as a daring contradiction to all this, the modern amid the eternal, there is only absence. The building, still half dormant, now houses archives and bureaucratic offices, its rooms filled not with canvases, but with filing cabinets and dust. Visitors pass through quickly, sensing that whatever story the place was meant to tell has long since gone unsaid. The generation of artists who come of age during this period inherit a muted legacy. They have studied the techniques of modernism, but not its courage. Their education has been academic, their sense of art's purpose theoretical. They speak of structure, not revelation, of markets, not meaning. The gallery replaces the studio as the center of gravity. Critics debate prices, not visions. The very word avant-garde becomes a marketing label, emptied of defiance. It is not that creativity has died, it never dies, but it breathes in shallower rhythms. The century that once promised liberation through art settles instead for sophistication. Peggy Guggenheim, in her final years, reads about this world from afar. Newspapers reach her small home with articles on new museums opening across Europe. She sees photographs of gleaming halls, vast and bright, filled with art that feels strangely voiceless. There are retrospectives of the early modernists, tidy celebrations of artists who, in another world, would have been her companions. She feels an odd tenderness toward them, as though glimpsing old friends through glass. Sometimes, when she looks at a photograph of a Picasso or a Miro, she catches herself thinking, I might have known them. Then the thought fades, gentle but piercing, like a wave retreating from shore. The absence of her Venetian museum leaves not only an architectural void, but an emotional one. The idea of a single private collection born of passion rather than policy never takes hold. The museums that do arise in its place, the great foundations of the later 20th century, belong to corporations, cities, governments. Their curators are careful, their exhibitions predictable. Art becomes another department of public life, subject to sponsorship and diplomacy. The wild, the personal, the ungoverned impulses of creation are gently corrected into conformity. The world becomes better organized, but less alive. And yet, even in this colder landscape, the longing for what might have been remains. Artists whisper to one another of the mythical collectors who once believed in impossible visions. They speak of Medici, of Barnes, of imagined figures who risked their fortunes for genius. Some of them even mention a rumor, a forgotten American heiress who almost built a museum in Venice, but never did. The story passes from teacher to student, growing vague with each retelling. Some call her Margaret, others say she drowned before finishing her work. None know her name for certain. But the myth persists, a faint ember of faith that somewhere, once, there was someone who believed that art could save the world. Venice, unchanged, becomes both symbol and mirror of this longing. The palazzo still gazes at the water, its reflection trembling with every tide. Sometimes scholars visit it, studying its unfinished structure, writing essays about incompletion as metaphor. They call it the museum that history forgot to build. Its facade becomes iconic in photographs of the city, an image of restraint and beauty, of potential unfulfilled. But those who stand before it in person often feel something else, not admiration, but ache. They sense that this quiet building knows more than it can tell, that it has witnessed a version of the world that never came to pass. In the absence of Peggy's legacy, art history bends toward a different philosophy. Collectors grow powerful, artists grow cautious, and museums become cathedrals of consensus. There are still masterpieces, still moments of brilliance, but the revolution of feeling, the belief that art could reorder the world's spirit, never takes root. The cultural energy that once belonged to painters and sculptors migrates to other forms: film, design, music. The canvas, once a battlefield for human truth, becomes decoration once again. And yet across time, absence has its own power. Sometimes the lack of a thing speaks louder than its presence. The Palazzo Venier dei Leoni, in its silent endurance, becomes that kind of symbol. Tourists who know nothing of art stop before it and feel an inexplicable calm, as though standing before an unanswered question. The water laps against its stones, whispering of what the city might have been if imagination had dared one step further. In the evenings, as the sun lowers into the lagoon, the building glows pale gold. From the opposite shore, it looks less like a failure than a promise deferred. Perhaps somewhere beyond this version of history, another world still unfolds, a world where a single woman chose differently, where the doors of that palace opened and the air inside filled with the hum of creation. Perhaps there, art remembered what it meant to be human, and the century learned to dream again. But here, in this quieter world, the dream remains sealed behind stone and water. Venice endures, luminous and mournful, its beauty unbroken, its heart untouched. The decades turn, and the world, now sleek with progress, finds itself strangely hollow. The cultural temperature cools. The air that once trembled with experimentation grows still. It is the long winter of the modern spirit, a time when humanity builds more and feels less. Across cities of steel and light, people fill museums, concert halls, and theaters, yet the pulse that once gave art its urgency is gone. The century has learned refinement, but not courage. The collective imagination no longer strains toward revelation. It turns inward, cautious, self-referential. What began as civilization's recovery becomes its sleep. In America, the energy of invention that once might have burned through the art scene moves elsewhere, to commerce, to technology, to entertainment. Art becomes a shadow, mimicking the glamour of the new world without questioning it. The idea of painting as rebellion fades into nostalgia. The names that once might have filled classrooms and galleries, Pollock, Rothko, Ernst, remain absent, and so the new generation lacks its compass. Without icons of defiance, young artists grow pragmatic, their ambitions shaped by galleries and grants rather than intuition. The market replaces the muse. By the 1980s, the phrase art movement has lost its weight. There are only trends now measured in headlines and sales. Europe, still proud of its past, freezes in its elegance. Cities like Paris and Rome polish their museums as one might polish relics. Venice, that eternal witness to beauty's endurance, becomes a stage for tourism rather than transformation. The Palazzo Venier dei Leoni, still unclaimed, now serves as a quiet archive of municipal documents. Clerks pass through its halls carrying files, unaware that they are walking on the bones of an unrealized miracle. On rainy days, the water rises to the base of its doors, and the building seems to sigh, as though burdened by the weight of what it never became. The coldness of this age is not born of cruelty, but of forgetfulness. Without living examples of faith in art, without those who risk themselves to keep imagination alive, society forgets why beauty matters. The arts continue, of course. They always do. But they no longer lead. They follow politics, economics, and fashion. The idea that a painting might save a soul or that a sculpture might alter a destiny becomes quaint. Even the universities, once bastions of aesthetic reflection, now teach art as history rather than prophecy. The sacred dimension of creation, the sense that artists speak for something larger than themselves, fades like breath on glass. Peggy Guggenheim, now a memory in an English cemetery, is almost entirely forgotten. Her name appears occasionally in genealogies, but her absence is what has shaped the world more profoundly than her presence ever could have. In our true timeline, her museum became a living bridge between modern art's wounded beginnings and its triumphant survival. Here, there is no bridge, only distance. The lineage of modernism fractures. Abstract art remains a whisper, surrealism a curiosity. The boldness that once reminded humanity that emotion and intellect could coexist dissolves into the gray neutrality of design. The cultural winter deepens, not because people cease to create, but because they cease to believe that creation can redeem. In Venice, the winters themselves seem colder. The fog clings longer to the canals. The bells echo more slowly across the lagoon. Tourists come, admiring the beauty they expect to find, yet even their admiration feels rehearsed. They take photographs of the Grand Canal at sunset, never noticing the unfinished palace at its bend. And yet, when some of them do, they pause, inexplicably moved. There is something haunting about the building, its proportion, its serenity, its refusal to complete itself. It seems to embody a secret the world has lost. It looks, one visitor remarks, like a dream that gave up. And perhaps that is exactly what it is. Still, the current of history is never fully frozen. Beneath the surface of this cultural frost, small fires continue to burn. A sculptor in Berlin begins to carve from debris left by the war, giving broken metal new life. A painter in Tokyo creates vast fields of color that seem to breathe. A filmmaker in New York captures silence so profound that audiences weep without knowing why. These isolated acts of beauty, disconnected though they are, whisper that the human spirit cannot live indefinitely without wonder. The world, though colder, is not dead. It is merely waiting to remember. And so the palazzo, in its long vigil, becomes a symbol not only of what was lost, but of what still might awaken. The Venetians, pragmatic as they are, begin to speak of it in softer tones. Some say it is blessed, others call it cursed. A few of the city's young artists, disillusioned by institutions, gather at its gates to sketch. They claim that the air there feels different, alive, as if the ghosts of forgotten masterpieces hover just beyond sight. One of them writes in a notebook, "The palace waits for the century to thaw." It is a simple line, yet it contains a strange hope that even in absence, beauty endures. By the dawn of the new millennium, the cultural frost begins, ever so slightly, to crack. The world's endless appetite for novelty starts to exhaust itself, and people grow hungry for meaning again. Scholars rediscover forgotten figures, women especially, whose stories were overshadowed by louder histories. Somewhere in a university archive, a researcher stumbles upon letters signed by Margaret Guggenheim, written in an elegant hand, full of reflections on art and loneliness. They are small, almost mundane, but they suggest a depth that surprises her. Soon, a book follows, a biography of the heiress who never built her museum. Critics call it The Patron Who Never Was. It sells modestly but finds devoted readers. And quietly, the Palazzo Venier dei Leoni becomes a site of pilgrimage for those who understand that history is shaped as much by what is lost as by what is achieved. The winter of culture never ends abruptly. It softens slowly, like ice under morning light. In this alternate century, the thaw begins not with revolution, but with remembrance. The silence that once seemed so final begins to hum faintly with possibility again. And if one stands by the Grand Canal at twilight, just as the mist begins to rise, one might hear the faint echo of a woman's footsteps, crossing a floor that was never built, carrying a painting that was never hung. The turn of the millennium brings with it a different kind of fervor, one born not of ideals but of imitation. As the cultural frost begins to thaw, the world rediscovers its appetite for art, but not yet its soul. Wealth and curiosity merge once more, and a new generation of patrons emerges, eager to claim the mantle of visionaries. They build museums, yes, and they collect, relentlessly, ostentatiously. Yet there is something hollow in their grandeur. These are not the sanctuaries Peggy Guggenheim once might have imagined, where artists and ideas could breathe together. These are monuments to visibility, not devotion. The patrons of this new age do not seek to preserve beauty. They seek to own it. And so the 21st century begins not with rebirth, but with replication. Across the world, art foundations rise like towers of glass. Their names bear those of bankers, developers, and corporations, and their opening galas gleam with champagne and self-congratulation. The works they display are spectacular, vast installations of light and metal, designed to overwhelm rather than invite. Critics hail them as proof that art is alive, yet their radiance feels strangely cold, like sunlight reflected on water with nothing beneath. These museums exist everywhere now, from Abu Dhabi to Los Angeles, from Shanghai to Berlin, but they share a sameness, a lack of intimacy. They are immaculate, curated, but devoid of risk. No single heart beats behind their collections. There is no singular vision guiding their walls, only the algorithmic taste of consensus. Had Peggy lived into this era, she might have looked upon it with both awe and unease. The world had caught up with the idea of the private museum, but not with its meaning. In her true life, she collected from love, from instinct, from the raw thrill of encountering something new and human. Here, where she never built her museum, the model of collecting evolves into spectacle without tenderness. Patronage becomes public relations, and exhibitions are planned with the logic of stock portfolios. The great art fairs, Basel, Frieze, Miami, become the new cathedrals of modernity, glittering and loud, where beauty is traded like currency. Artists themselves, now brands in an economy of attention, learn to adapt, crafting not revelations but products. And yet, beneath this glittering surface, a quiet discomfort grows. Critics begin to speak of an age of substitutes. They mean not only the art itself, but the spirit that surrounds it, the sense that imitation has replaced imagination, simulation has replaced sincerity. Visitors to these new museums often leave impressed but untouched. They see everything and feel nothing. The abundance of art begins to produce its own kind of poverty. Too much to see, too little to remember. The human encounter with art, intimate, transformative, trembling, fades into the blur of spectacle. In Venice, the old Palazzo Vigne de' Leoni remains a counterpoint to all this excess. It has never been modernized, never turned into a brand. The building still sits by the canal, patient and incomplete, as if refusing to join the race. It becomes, in its own quiet way, a place of pilgrimage for those disillusioned by perfection. Artists come to stand before it, sketching its proportions, wondering what might have been had someone once filled its rooms with courage. A few locals begin to tend the space voluntarily, cleaning its courtyard, lighting candles in its windows at night. Slowly, it becomes less a ruin and more a shrine. Not to Peggy herself, for most no longer know her name, but to the possibility of sincerity in art, to the idea that creation is a form of faith, not commerce. Outside Venice, a handful of thinkers begin to write about the phenomenon. They speak of ghost patronage, a term describing the invisible influence of those who were never there. The argument is that absence, too, can shape culture, that sometimes what a society fails to build defines it more than what it creates. Essays appear comparing Peggy Guggenheim's unfulfilled destiny to an architectural metaphor, the empty foundation that supports an entire unseen structure. They suggest that perhaps the palazzo's silence was necessary, that only through its emptiness could later generations understand the difference between a museum and a mausoleum. The idea circulates quietly among artists who feel lost amid the noise of the new world. In those same years, the global art market reaches absurd heights. Paintings sell for hundreds of millions, sculptures for more than the cost of cities. The public watches in fascination as record after record breaks. But the awe is not reverent, it is transactional. The thrill of a gamble well played. The language of art merges with the language of commerce, investment, return, liquidity. In this world, beauty is not priceless, it is priced. What might once have been salvation becomes spectacle. The museum is no longer a refuge, it is an advertisement. Still, there are moments when the illusion cracks. During one humid Venetian summer, a storm floods the canal, and the water rises high enough to enter the old palazzo's lower hall. Locals gather to protect it, bringing sandbags and candles. A journalist photographs them, young and old, anonymous, standing ankle-deep in water around the empty building. The image is published internationally, titled "Saving the Unfinished Museum." For reasons no one can quite explain, it captures the public imagination. Commentators call it a metaphor for the century, though few can say why. Some see it as a sign that people still long for meaning. Others see it as a gesture of mourning for what never existed. Either way, the photograph becomes iconic. The palazzo's facade, half-lit and surrounded by rippling water, seems to breathe again. For a moment, the world remembers. A few wealthy donors offer to restore the building, to transform it into a cultural space once more. But bureaucracy, funding disputes, and indifference intervene. The project falters, then vanishes. The palazzo remains as it was, unfinished, serene, waiting. And perhaps it is better that way, for its power lies in refusal, in the purity of its incompletion. Every other museum of the age screams its presence. This one whispers absence. It reminds the world that art's true purpose is not to adorn, but to awaken. And so, as the century deepens, the palazzo becomes a mirror for the conscience of culture. Those who come to see it do not find exhibits or guided tours. They find only stillness, light and reflection, the sound of the canal, the scent of stone. They find, too, an echo of their own longing, that human ache to be part of something enduring and true. In that silence, they begin to understand what all the substitutes of their age have tried to conceal, that beauty cannot be manufactured, only found, that art cannot be possessed, only believed in, and that somewhere, in the spaces between what was and what could have been, the soul of the world still waits to be seen. By the time the century's noise begins to subside, Peggy Guggenheim exists only as a faint trace in the archives of memory. Her name, when it appears at all, is in footnotes or obscure essays, rarely spoken aloud. The grand narratives of art history have marched on without her. Movements have risen and fallen, leaving behind the glittering dust of commerce and fame. Yet somewhere, in the quiet margins of these stories, there lingers a shadow, a life that might have been the thread uniting so many others. Her lost years unfold not in the world that remembers her, but in the one that forgot. She grows old in England, far from the restless pulse of the cities she once dreamed of joining. The world outside her window changes faster than she can comprehend. Televisions multiply, cars hum through the countryside, and art, that private religion of her youth, becomes a form of entertainment for the comfortable. She reads about new movements, pop art, minimalism, conceptualism, and cannot tell whether she admires or fears them. Their cool detachment confuses her. They seem clever, but she wonders where the heart is gone. In the quiet evenings, she pours herself a glass of wine and imagines the faces of the artists she never met, the ones she might have saved, the ones who might have changed her. Sometimes, in her loneliness, she feels that she has disappointed not the world, but beauty itself. Her house becomes a shrine to unexpressed longing. Books line the walls, Proust, Freud, Rilke, Woolf, voices that speak of interior worlds. On her dressing table sits a single-framed photograph of her father, Benjamin Guggenheim, the man whose death so many decades earlier had first cracked her world open. The sea had taken him, and in some strange way it feels as though it had also taken her path, her courage, her possibility. Every now and then she writes to distant acquaintances, old friends from her charitable circles or acquaintances from London society. But her letters are cautious, the tone formal. She rarely mentions art anymore, except to say that she misses the quiet it once promised her. In this alternate life, Peggy becomes the kind of person history passes by gently, respectfully, as one passes a grave in a forgotten garden. Yet her solitude has a strange dignity to it. There is no bitterness in her. She has made peace with her smaller existence. She has learned to find grace in tending roses, in rereading novels, in the simple rhythm of seasons. Her imagination, though stilled, is not extinguished. It is merely turned inward, like a flame protecting itself from wind. She dreams often of Venice, though she has not returned in years. In her dreams, the canals are silver in the moonlight, and she is walking through a palace filled with paintings, though she cannot see their faces. Every time she reaches out to touch one, she wakes with her hand suspended in the dark. Her later notebooks reveal a curious mixture of serenity and regret. Perhaps, she writes once, The tragedy of my life is not that I did nothing, but that I nearly did something. The sentence stands alone on the page, underlined once. It is a confession without drama, almost tender in its acceptance. She no longer blames herself for her hesitations. She understands that people rarely recognize the moments that define them until they have passed. Her life, she muses, was made of doorways she admired but never walked through. Yet even in this admission, there is no despair, only awareness, a quiet acknowledgement that not all souls are meant to disturb the world. Some are meant merely to bear witness to what could have been. Outside her small life, the century grows louder. The global art market swells. New billionaires purchase fragments of the past she once ignored. Museums expand like empires, and the public treats them as pilgrimage sites, though few remember what pilgrimage was meant to mean. Somewhere, deep in the archives of a newspaper, a journalist researching women in art stumbles upon Peggy's name. She writes a short article about her philanthropy, her unfulfilled ambitions, her connection to the great Guggenheim dynasty. The article ends with a single photograph, a middle-aged woman by a Venetian canal, looking out across the water, her expression unreadable. The caption reads, "Margaret Guggenheim, patron of causes 1934. It circulates briefly, then vanishes. No one asks who she was looking at or what she was seeing. And yet, as years slip further into shadow, Peggy's spirit seems to linger in the world she never shaped. The Palazzo Venier dei Leoni, though still unclaimed, begins to attract quiet attention from those who sense its peculiar gravity. Artists stop there on their way to the Biennale and leave small offerings, a sketch, a note, a single flower. They cannot explain why, but they feel its pull, as if the building remembers something they do not. Some say that on calm evenings, if you stand close enough to its walls, you can hear faint music, as though from another room, notes from a record player echoing across time. Others speak of a woman's silhouette briefly visible at the balcony, watching the water as the sun descends. In her final year, Peggy falls ill, confined to bed for months. Her nurses say she often stares at the window for hours, murmuring softly about Venice, about the sound of oars, about the smell of wet stone. She drifts in and out of sleep, sometimes lucid, sometimes speaking to people no one else can see. Once, as dusk settles, she smiles suddenly and whispers, "They've opened the doors at last." The nurse does not understand, but nods, smoothing her hand. Peggy dies that night quietly, as though following the rhythm of the tide. There is no museum, no legacy, no inheritance of art. Her fortune, modest by her family's standards, goes to charity. Her personal belongings, books, letters, photographs, are boxed and forgotten in an attic. But Venice remembers. When the news of her death reaches the city, a group of young painters light candles by the palazzo. They have never met her, know little of her story, but feel instinctively that she belongs to that place, that its silence and her life share the same rhythm. The candles flicker against the marble, reflecting on the canal like constellations beneath the surface of the water. For one night, the air seems charged, as if her spirit has returned home, not to reignite what was lost, but to rest within it. It is strange how lives, even those that never fulfill their promise, can leave imprints deeper than deeds. Peggy Guggenheim, in this quiet version of history, becomes not the builder of museums, but the embodiment of unrealized beauty itself. The living metaphor of the century's hesitations, its brilliance postponed. And perhaps there is a kind of grace in that. For not all contributions to history must be loud. Some exist as silence made visible, a reminder that the distance between creation and restraint, between destiny and fear, is where humanity most resembles itself. The world turns, and Venice endures, half dream, half ruin, still shimmering at the edge of time. By the dawn of the 21st century, its canals gleam beneath the same indifferent sun that once fell upon Peggy's unclaimed palace. Tourists glide past in boats, cameras raised, their laughter mingling with the lapping of the tide. Yet for those who pause long enough to listen, there is an undercurrent in the city's rhythm, a faint sorrow beneath its beauty, a silence that seems to hum through the marble. It is as though something luminous once tried to bloom here and never quite managed to take root. The Palazzo Venier dei Leoni, still incomplete, still quietly majestic, holds that silence like a breath that has not yet been released. In our history, that building became a meeting of worlds, a declaration that modern art could belong among the palaces of the old. Here, it remains mute, a symbol of the city's devotion to its past and its refusal to imagine the future. Venice, without Peggy's museum, becomes a place of looking backward. The tourists come to adore its decay, to marvel at its endurance, but not to see anything new. Painters who visit find themselves painting the city itself, its light, its reflections, its ghosts, because there is no living art to challenge them. The city's galleries are filled with reproductions of old masters, its churches preserved like reliquaries. Beauty here is embalmed, not reborn. Venice becomes the museum that Peggy never built, a museum of memory enclosed within itself. Across Europe, the mood is much the same. Modern art, robbed of its bridge to feeling, becomes theoretical and distant. Museums grow larger, their exhibitions ever more polished, but the sense of communion, the quiet awe that comes from standing before a work that speaks to something beyond words, fades. Visitors read the plaques, take photographs, and move on. Art is admired, even worshipped, but rarely believed in. Without the heartbeat that Peggy once carried, the belief that art and life could nourish each other, the world's relationship with beauty becomes passive. People love art the way they love stars, from a distance, untouchable and safe. And yet, there are moments when the old light tries to return. Every few years, a new artist emerges whose work stirs something ancient, something reminiscent of that lost sincerity. Critics call these outbursts revivals, though they never last. They flare brightly and fade, swallowed by the machinery of fame. Without the continuity that a place like Peggy's museum would have provided, each generation must rediscover the same truths on its own, unaware that they have already been learned and forgotten 100 times before. The story of art becomes cyclical: hope, recognition, exhaustion, and amnesia, turning endlessly like water around a stone. Still, the palazzo remains, luminous even in neglect. It has become a legend without a narrative, a question without an answer. Some nights, when the moon is high and the air is still, the locals say you can see faint light inside the shuttered windows, a glow neither electric nor candlelit, as if something within the walls remembers what it was meant to hold. Scholars visit, intrigued by the mystery, and speculate endlessly. Was it meant to be a gallery, a home, a monument? No one knows, but all agree that there is something haunting in its restraint, as though it chose to remain silent out of dignity. Venice herself seems to have absorbed this melancholy. Without the infusion of modern imagination, the city grows into its own reflection, beautiful, fragile, and self-absorbed. The Biennale continues, of course, but it feels like performance now, a ritual repeated out of habit. The pavilions dazzle, but their energy dissipates into the air, leaving no mark. Artists exhibit, critics debate, collectors purchase, and yet everyone senses that something essential is missing, the feeling that art can still alter the direction of the soul. Peggy's absence has become the absence of belief itself, and yet absence has its own form of presence. In the hush of early morning before the crowds arrive, the city belongs again to the pigeons and the sea. The first light touches the water, turning it to silver, and the palazzo catches it, sending it rippling across the canal. Gondoliers preparing for the day sometimes stop and watch this moment, this reflection that seems to breathe. They cannot explain why, but it fills them with peace. Perhaps, without knowing it, they are witnessing the faint echo of what might have been, the light that Peggy would have given to the world, still lingering like perfume long after its source has vanished. Some visitors feel it too. A young student of art traveling alone pauses before the palace one evening. She knows nothing of its story. She only knows that it moves her. Standing by the stone balustrade, she sketches the building in her notebook and writes beneath it, "Unfinished but alive." That phrase becomes her mantra as she grows older, guiding her through her own uncertain years. She becomes a curator, one who believes not in spectacle but in intimacy, in the quiet power of art to restore faith. When asked what inspired her, she always mentions that day in Venice, that silent building by the water. The world has forgotten Peggy, but her absence continues to awaken something in those who are capable of listening. Perhaps that is how light works, not always as illumination, but as afterglow. A radiance that continues even when its source has burned away. The palazzo stands as that kind of afterglow, a vessel for the memory of what beauty might have been if courage had met opportunity. And maybe this is its truest form, a museum not of paintings, but of possibility. It teaches without preaching, whispers without showing. It suggests that there are lives, entire histories, that succeed not in what they build, but in what they leave undone. In this world without her light, humanity learns a different lesson, that art, like love, is never guaranteed, and that its endurance depends on the fragile willingness of a few souls to believe in it completely. Peggy Guggenheim never built her museum, never gathered her constellation of artists, never made Venice the sanctuary of modern dreams. But even in her absence, the outline of her light remains, a quiet glow reflected upon the water, a reminder that every act of imagination, even unrealized, leaves something behind. And as the night descends over the lagoon, the lamps of Venice shimmer like small, defiant stars. The palazzo, bathed in their reflection, seems for a heartbeat to awaken. The water rises and falls against its stones, a slow, rhythmic breathing. The city, the century, the world, all of it inhales the silence of what was never made and exhales something softer, something like forgiveness. For even the light that never shines leaves warmth in the dark. The years move forward as though time itself has softened, like paint thinned with water. Venice remains, as it always has, suspended between endurance and surrender. The Palazzo Venier dei Leoni stands quietly by the canal, no longer decaying, no longer repaired, simply existing, as if it has reached the final serenity of acceptance. The world that once rushed past it in ignorance now drifts by more slowly. Tourists still point, scholars still speculate, artists still sketch, but the tone has changed. There is reverence now, not for what the palace is, but for what it represents, the beauty of the unfinished, the nobility of what might have been. Time has given the building its own mythology, one that stretches beyond the woman who once dreamed before it. Peggy Guggenheim, long since dust, has become a symbol of humanity's fragile balance between action and hesitation, between vision and fear. The philosophers of this new age speak of the counterfactual soul, the lives that history never allowed to unfold, but which continue to breathe in imagination. Peggy belongs to this quiet pantheon. She is invoked not as a collector or patron, but as the spirit of unchosen roads, a reminder that destiny, too, can have its shadows. Some call her the saint of unrealized art, a figure whose very absence gave meaning to everything left undone. It is a strange form of immortality, yet perhaps more honest than the monuments of fame. For the world she did not build has in its stillness come to mirror something profound, the truth that art, like love, often lives most vividly in the space between desire and fulfillment. By now, the palazzo has become a destination for reflection, No ticket booths, no exhibitions, no guided tours. Just an open courtyard where the weary sit and listen to the water. On its walls, ivy curls upward, tracing shapes that look almost like veins or constellations. Some days, the wind carries music from a nearby church, and it drifts through the arches like a benediction. At sunset, when the sky burns gold, the facade glows with a softness that feels alive. Those who come in the evening often describe the same sensation, a sudden awareness of how fragile all ambition is, and yet how beautiful its failure can be. Standing there, people speak in hushed voices, as though afraid to disturb something sacred. The art world, ever restless, continues to reinvent itself. Digital canvases, immersive installations, museums in orbit. But its noise only makes the quiet of the palazzo more resonant. In every age of innovation, there is always a longing for stillness, for the human pulse beneath the machinery of progress. Peggy's ghost seems to haunt that longing, not as a reproach, but as a kind of guide. She does not ask what the world might have achieved had she been braver. She asks instead what courage remains in the act of simply imagining. To dream, she seems to whisper through the stone, is also to create. Even the dream unrealized changes the shape of time. And so the story of her absence becomes a meditation on presence itself. What if one life, by not acting, allowed the rest of us to feel the weight of choice more deeply? What if the museum she never built taught future generations something that the one she might have built never could? That beauty is not a possession, but a condition of being awake. It is tempting to think of Peggy as a ghost of regret, but perhaps she is something gentler. A reminder that not every destiny must end in triumph, that silence too can be a form of contribution. Her unbuilt museum stands not as failure, but as witness to the fragility of art, to the patience of history, to the mercy that lives in incompletion. Every year, on the anniversary of her death, Venetians leave flowers at the edge of the canal. No one remembers exactly why the tradition began. Some say it was started by a group of young painters decades ago, others by a poet who found her story in a forgotten journal. Whatever its origin, the ritual endures. The flowers drift upon the water, their petals scattering like color across the gray-green surface. The tide carries them past the palazzo, where they catch for a moment against the steps before floating out toward the lagoon. It is a quiet procession, witnessed by no one in particular, yet it feels as if the city itself is offering an apology for the silence, for the waiting, for the beauty left unrealized. As twilight falls, the world grows softer. The horizon blurs between sea and sky, and the first lamps flicker to life. From a distance, Venice looks eternal, though anyone who knows her understands that she is always dissolving, always reborn. The palazzo remains unmoving, yet everything about it changes with the light. Some say this is the truest kind of art, not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that humbly teaches the viewer to see. Perhaps this was always Peggy's gift, even if she never offered it consciously, to remind us that art is not confined to walls or collections, but woven into the act of looking, of feeling, of remembering. And so, at the end of this alternate history, the question remains, quiet, eternal, unanswered. What if Peggy Guggenheim had built her museum of modern art? Would the world be brighter, bolder, more compassionate? Would humanity's relationship to beauty have been saved from commerce and cynicism? No one can know. Yet perhaps the more important question is this: would we still have learned the same humility, the same awareness of how close greatness always lies to hesitation? For in her absence, the world discovered another kind of wisdom, that art does not always need to be finished to be complete, that even an unbuilt museum can teach us the necessity of dreaming. In the end, Venice breathes as it always has. The water laps softly against the marble. The wind carries a faint scent of salt and memory. Somewhere, In that half-silence between the living and the imagined, the spirit of Peggy Guggenheim still drifts along the canal, neither triumphant nor mournful, simply at peace. The light she never kindled remains suspended in reflection, trembling upon the water like the last word of a prayer, and the world, though changed beyond recognition, continues to circle that same quiet truth, that art, like life itself, is most alive when it hovers between what is and what might have been.